How much have you had to drink today?
About two, maybe three.
2 or 3 beers?
No, bottles.
So you have been drinking water and a Sprite. That's not what you said.
It is. You just
Put your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for DUI.
On a Thursday afternoon in mid-June, retired Staff Sergeant Gerald Whitaker pulled out of a Sunoco convenience store at 3:47 p.m. in Jacksonville, Florida, carrying a plastic bag containing 2 bottles of water, a Sprite, and a bag of peanuts. At 61 years old, with 23 years of military service behind him, 2 tours overseas, and 4 years into retirement, Gerald was beginning a routine 2-hour drive to his sister's house in Gainesville. His doctor had instructed him to stay hydrated during the drive, and the snacks were for sustenance along the way. What should have been an unremarkable afternoon would instead become a cautionary tale about how assumptions, once formed, can override evidence and consume hours of someone's life with profound consequences. Officer Aaron McCready of the Jacksonville Police Department had been driving behind Gerald's sedan for 2 blocks before activating his lights. At 31 years old with 4 years on the force, McCready had assessed Gerald's driving as slightly problematic. The vehicle had drifted toward the center line during a right turn before correcting itself. This observation existed in a gray space between legitimate concern and pretext, the kind of traffic stop justification that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on what unfolded next. McCready's mind, however, had already begun forming a narrative before the stop was even initiated. Gerald, displaying the discipline and respect for authority that characterized his military background, pulled over immediately when the lights came on. Both hands remained on the wheel. He had been driving since he was 16 years old without a single DUI or moving violation. He was cooperative and prepared to comply with whatever the officer needed. But McCready's first question, asked before requesting license or registration, before establishing the actual nature of the supposed violation, and before any objective indicators of impairment had been observed, revealed the direction his thoughts were already traveling. "How much have you had to drink today?" the officer asked directly. Gerald, who had just spent 15 minutes inside the air-conditioned convenience store looking at paper maps and thinking about his drive, answered the question plainly and without anticipation of why it was being asked. "About 2, maybe 3, he said. He was referring to the bottles of water and Sprite he had just purchased, items visible in the plastic bag on his passenger seat. The answer was truthful but ambiguous to someone primed to interpret it as an admission about alcohol consumption. McCready immediately requested that Gerald step out of the vehicle, but when asked what was wrong with his driving, Gerald explained that he had taken a slightly wide turn and corrected it. McCready insisted on the exit anyway. Gerald, moving with the specific slowness of a 61-year-old man with a hearing aid and 2 bad knees from a military career that had involved carrying heavy equipment for far too long, complied without resistance. When McCready repeated his question about drinking, Gerald provided the clarification that should have ended this line of inquiry. "I just told you, 2 waters and a Sprite. Before that, I had coffee this morning, and between the coffee and now nothing." He pointed to the plastic bag, still visible on the passenger seat, containing the sealed bottles from the Sunoco store. The receipt, time-stamped at 3:31 p.m., was folded at the top of the bag, clearly visible. But McCready, who had already constructed a narrative in which Gerald had admitted to drinking, did not incorporate this crucial clarification. Instead of recognizing that he and Gerald had been speaking about 2 entirely different things, alcohol consumption versus beverage bottles, McCready continued down the path he had selected. He looked at the plastic bag. He could see the bottle tops through the plastic. He could see the receipt. He chose not to pick it up to verify its contents. He had formed an interpretation, and he would now defend that interpretation against the evidence being presented to him. McCready informed Gerald that he would need to perform a field sobriety test. This is when Gerald, drawing on 23 years of military experience and understanding of proper procedure, made a critical decision. He declined the field sobriety test and instead offered an alternative, a breathalyzer test, which would provide an objective, scientific measurement of his blood alcohol content. This was not a legal refusal of lawful orders. It was the invocation of a legal right to choose the more reliable testing method. Gerald's reasoning was sound. At 61 years old, with military service-related orthopedic injuries to both knees and a hearing aid that was still causing him adjustment difficulties in environments with background noise, field sobriety tests would be inherently unreliable as a measure of his actual sobriety. The test is designed around the assumption of a healthy baseline, and Gerald's baseline was not typical. A breathalyzer, by contrast, would provide an indisputable answer to the question of whether he had consumed alcohol. "I'd like to decline that and submit to a breathalyzer," Gerald stated clearly. "I know what it can be used for. I'm telling you that I've had nothing to drink. I'm 61 years old with 2 bad knees from military service, and a field sobriety test is not going to produce accurate results for my baseline regardless of my sobriety. I'd rather go straight to a breathalyzer." McCready paused. This was a moment where the situation could have been resolved. A breathalyzer administered on the side of the road would have taken 4 minutes and would have produced a number, 000, that would have ended the stop entirely. Instead, McCready insisted on the field sobriety test as part of standard protocol, rejecting Gerald's reasonable and legally appropriate alternative. Officer Dylan Reeves, a 3-year veteran of the Jacksonville Police Department, arrived as backup at 4:06 p.m. looking at the scene, Gerald standing at the side of his car with both hands visible, the plastic bag on the passenger seat with sealed bottles visible through the transparent plastic, the receipt folded at the top. Reeves had access to information that could have resolved the situation immediately. McCready had not checked the receipt. He had seen the bag through the plastic, had seen bottles, and had continued the conversation without verifying what those bottles actually contained. When Reeves asked what they were working with, McCready reported a possible DUI with the subject refusing the field sobriety test. Gerald corrected the record. "I didn't admit to drinking alcohol. I told him I had water and a Sprite." He indicated the bag. "It's right there, sealed receipts in the bag." Reeves asked if McCready had confirmed the bag contents. McCready admitted he had only observed them through the plastic. Had he checked the receipt? He had not. Despite this, McCready insisted on administering the field sobriety test. Gerald, maintaining his military discipline and understanding of institutional process, declined again and reiterated his request for a breathalyzer, a request that was legally sound and that he had documented being made on body camera. McCready ordered Gerald to turn around. When Gerald asked if he was being arrested and what the charge was, McCready responded only with orders to turn around. The officer was escalating rather than resolving. McCready handcuffed Gerald, and in that moment, according to Reeves's body camera footage, Gerald's face registered not anger or panic, but the measured resignation of a man who understood that the situation had become fixed in a particular direction, and that the correct response was to document everything and address it through proper channels. Standing at the side of his car in handcuffs, Gerald made a formal statement for the record. "I'd like to note for the record that the bag on my passenger seat contains 2 water bottles and 1 Sprite, all sealed with a purchase receipt from the Sunoco at Westside in Crestfield, timestamped at 3:31 p.m. today. I have not consumed alcohol. I will take a breathalyzer at the station, and I want the body cam footage preserved." Reeves, standing at the passenger door, could see everything Gerald had described. He picked up the receipt, read it, and set it back down. He had just reviewed the document that proved Gerald's account was accurate. Instead of immediately reporting this exculpatory evidence to a superior, which was his obligation, Reeves remained silent as the stop continued for another 24 minutes. At the police station at 4:41 p.m., a different officer administered the breathalyzer as required by protocol, not McCready but a processing officer following standard procedure. The machine read 0, not trace amounts, not a borderline reading. 0. The officer read it again and noted it in the log. Gerald had been in the processing area for 11 minutes at that point. He had asked for water when he arrived. He had been given water. He had been cooperative throughout, maintaining the same quiet, plain demeanor that had characterized his behavior on the side of the road. The processing officer, recognizing the significance of this result, made a decision that would prove crucial. Rather than returning the breathalyzer result to McCready, who had initiated the stop, the officer brought it to the watch commander. This institutional decision, to go upward rather than sideways in the chain of command, was the first procedural action of the evening that went in the right direction. The watch commander read the result, read it again, and asked the processing officer to walk him through the stop. The processing officer explained what he knew, that Gerald had requested a breathalyzer before being handcuffed, that he had documented the bag contents on camera, that he had a 0 blood alcohol reading, and that his demeanor throughout intake had been that of a man who was clearly not intoxicated. At 4:55 p.m., not the following morning but that same evening, the watch commander pulled McCready's body camera footage and watched all 47 minutes from the moment the lights came on until the cruiser door closed at the station. He watched McCready ask about drinking before license or registration. He watched Gerald say, about 2, maybe 3, and then watched the moment at minute 2 when Gerald clearly stated 2 waters and a Sprite. He watched McCready continue as though this clarification had never occurred. He watched Reeves pick up the receipt, read it, and set it back down without communicating its contents to McCready. He watched Gerald make his formal statement about the bag contents while standing in handcuffs with the sealed bottles and receipt in plain view. The watch commander called internal affairs at 5:08 p.m. that evening. Gerald was released at 5:24 p.m. The watch commander came to the release area personally, not standard procedure, and communicated what had occurred. He told Gerald that the breathalyzer result was 0, that internal affairs had been notified, and that the body camera footage had been secured. He told Gerald he was sorry for what had happened that night. The internal affairs review opened the following morning. The body camera footage from both McCready and Reeves had been secured at 4:55 p.m. the previous evening. The Sunoco's exterior security camera footage, which showed Gerald at the register at 3:31 p.m. purchasing 2 waters and a Sprite and receiving the receipt, was subpoenaed on day 2 and preserved on day 3. The store's camera would later be described by the review board as definitively establishing the sequence of events in a manner that left no interpretive ambiguity. The timestamp on that camera placed Gerald at the register at 3:31 p.m., buying non-alcoholic beverages, 16 minutes before McCready asked him how much he had drunk. The review board examined the evidence systematically. They watched both body camera feeds. They reviewed the chronology of the stop, the wide turn that had been the stated basis for the stop, the initial DUI question asked before license or registration, Gerald's first answer about 2 or 3 bottles, Gerald's clarification at minute 2, and McCready's continued DUI framing after the clarification despite having heard it. They watched Gerald refuse the field sobriety test and offer a breathalyzer instead. They watched McCready decline the breathalyzer offer in favor of continuing with the field test. They watched the refusals escalate to handcuffs. They watched Gerald's statement about the bag contents with the sealed bottles in plain view. The review board identified 3 main elements in their findings against McCready. First, they found that McCready had asked about drinking before requesting license or registration, and before any objective indicators of impairment had been observed. The wide turn was the stated basis for the stop, but the first question had been about alcohol, suggesting that the DUI framing had preceded the observed conduct rather than following from it. The board described this as a stop initiated through a preconceived interpretive framework rather than observed conduct. Second, they found what they termed selective interpretation. Gerald had provided a clarification at minute 2 that, if accepted, would have terminated the DUI inquiry entirely. Yet McCready had continued the DUI inquiry for 38 more minutes without incorporating that clarification into his assessment. The board concluded, Officer McCready received a clarification at minute 2 of the stop that, if accepted, would have terminated the DUI inquiry. The subsequent conduct of the stop indicates that the clarification was not incorporated into the officer's ongoing assessment, suggesting that the officer's initial interpretation had become fixed in a manner inconsistent with the objective evidence available. This finding of fixed interpretation documented that McCready's mind had locked into a narrative and would not be moved by facts. Third, they found that McCready had refused Gerald's legally appropriate alternative to the field test. Gerald had offered a breathalyzer at minute 26 of the stop. McCready had declined and insisted on continuing with the field sobriety test. The board found no procedural basis for this refusal. The breathalyzer was a more objective measure. Gerald had invoked his right to decline the field test with a legally appropriate alternative, and McCready's insistence on the field test had extended the stop by at least 20 minutes and had ultimately produced an arrest rather than the resolution that the breathalyzer would have provided in 4 minutes on the side of the road. Officer Reeves, who had read the receipt and failed to immediately report its contents to his supervising officer, received a formal reprimand for failure to intervene when exculpatory evidence was obtained. His attorney argued that he had been a backup officer with limited authority to override the primary officer's decision, but the board acknowledged the chain of command constraint and still issued the reprimand, citing his obligation to report exculpatory evidence to a supervisor immediately upon reading it. McCready received a suspension without pay, effective on day 17 after the findings were filed. The suspension letter cited 4 violations: initiating a DUI inquiry without observable impairment indicators, failing to incorporate exculpatory clarification into the stop's ongoing assessment, refusing a breathalyzer alternative offered by the subject, and making an arrest without sufficient probable cause given the available evidence. His union filed a grievance, but after reviewing the footage, including the moment at minute 2 when Gerald said water and a Sprite, and McCready continued as though he hadn't heard, the grievance was denied on day 31. The termination recommendation came on day 20 and was approved by the division chief on day 24. Florida's Criminal Justice Standards and Training Commission received the referral on day 28 and reviewed the case on day 41. McCready's certification was revoked on day 49. His appeal was filed on day 63, but after the appeal panel watched the footage twice, particularly the moment at minute 2, the appeal was denied on day 77. The civil lawsuit was filed 34 days after the stop and named McCready personally, the Jacksonville Police Department, and the city. It cited wrongful arrest, civil rights violation, and negligent use of the DUI framework without observable impairment indicators. Gerald's attorney included a medical expert declaration stating that field sobriety tests are known to produce unreliable results in individuals with hearing impairment and lower body orthopedic conditions. Gerald's medical profile placed him in both categories. This documentation of how the field test would have been specifically inappropriate for Gerald, not just legally unjustified, but medically ill-suited, strengthened the case considerably. The city's legal team called for a settlement meeting on day 42. The settlement was reached on day 58, $850,000. This was lower than the range that the wrongful arrest finding could have supported, because Gerald's actual damages, while real and documented, had not included extended incarceration or significant employment impact. He was retired. The night had cost him a dinner with his sister, 11 months of intermittent stress, one attorney's retainer, and something for which there was no line item in a damages calculation, a sense that a system had malfunctioned. But the settlement included more than just money. It required mandatory training for all Jacksonville Police Department officers on the proper sequencing of DUI stops, specifically that impairment indicators must be observed before the DUI inquiry is initiated. It required a revised policy on subject-offered alternatives to field sobriety tests, mandating that a breathalyzer offered in lieu of a field test be administered immediately rather than deferred to the station. It required an independent review of all DUI stops made by McCready in the prior 4 years. And it required something that was not a standard settlement condition, an official departmental acknowledgement that Gerald Whitaker had not been impaired at any point during the stop on June 14th. Gerald's attorney had included this in the first draft. Gerald had specifically requested it, not for the record in a legal sense, not for leverage, but because he had spent 23 years in institutions where accountability came with documentation. What had happened on Westside Boulevard was a thing that should be documented and acknowledged rather than settled around. The city signed this acknowledgement on day 58. 2 months after the settlement, Gerald drove back through Jacksonville on a Saturday in August. He had no particular reason to go down Westside Boulevard, but his route to his sister's house in Gainesville took him through the city. He had another paper map on the passenger seat. 301 south of Gainesville was still unreliable for GPS signals, and he had bought 2 waters and a Sprite at a convenience store that morning. He had considered buying something different, just to break the association with what he had purchased in June. Then he decided that the thing he was going to drink on a 2-hour drive to Gainesville was 2 waters and a Sprite, and that it wasn't going to change because of 47 minutes on a road shoulder. Driving toward Gainesville on I-95 South, Gerald thought about the question that had started everything. How much have you had to drink today? He thought about it a lot in the months since, not with bitterness exactly, but with the specific attention of someone trying to understand how a thing had happened so he could think clearly about it. The officer had been wrong. That was established. But the mechanism of the wrong was interesting in a way that mechanisms are interesting to people who have spent careers in organizations, where the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one is often a single misaligned assumption that nobody caught in time. The mechanism had been straightforward. Gerald had said 2 or 3 when asked how much he had drunk. McCready had heard 2 or 3 and filled in the rest with what he had already decided, that Gerald had been drinking alcohol. Then Gerald had said water and a Sprite. McCready had heard this and filed it under subject changing story rather than subject clarifying misunderstanding. 2 people in 2 different conversations that never aligned, with a false premise in minute 1, and every subsequent exchange built on that false foundation. A structure that looked like an investigation, but was actually the defense of an error. Gerald had seen this before in different settings with different stakes, but with the same mechanism. A conclusion formed early and then maintained against incoming evidence, because maintaining it was less costly in the moment than acknowledging the error. Except it never was less costly. It was always more costly. The moment always came when the breathalyzer read 0, and the question became how far the error had traveled before it stopped. In this case, the answer was 47 minutes on the side of the road, 11 minutes in the processing area, an $850,000 settlement, and 1 signed acknowledgement. This case represents far more than a single officer's error. It illustrates how institutional failures cascade when assumptions override evidence, when procedures become tools for confirming rather than investigating, and when alternatives to dangerous options are refused. It shows what happens when someone asks a simple question, "How much have you had to drink?" and receives an answer that is technically truthful but open to misinterpretation, and nobody stops to check. It demonstrates how 1 moment of miscommunication, left unresolved, generates 47 minutes of additional contact that should never have occurred, resulting in a wrongful arrest, professional termination, certification revocation, civil settlement, and institutional reforms. It also shows what can happen when an institutional process actually works, when a watch commander goes upward rather than sideways at 4:55 p.m., when body cameras preserve evidence, when receipts in bags are actually checked, and when accountability is documented rather than avoided. Gerald's case resulted in mandatory training changes, policy revisions, independent reviews, and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. These are not standard outcomes. They occurred because the evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was complete, and the institutional structure had a mechanism, however imperfect, for addressing serious failures. This is the story of 47 minutes on a road shoulder in Jacksonville, Florida. It is the story of what happens when nobody stops to check. It is the story of how institutional processes can fail and how it can, when circumstances align, eventually work. Most importantly, it is the story of a retired military veteran who approached a wrongful arrest with the discipline and documentation practices of someone accustomed to institutions where accountability matters, and who used that approach to create a record that forced the system to confront its error and commit to doing better.